Spensky. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Barbara. When I did this work, I was a full-time research staff at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. So this is joint work with a bunch of my colleagues there, some folks at Stevens Institute and Boston University. And actually, just even coming up with the title for our SoK was pretty complicated because we're looking at all these papers, all this research, and it's a mess. It's so complicated to figure out what's going on here. So that's what we settled on. So the motivation for doing this SoK, what we really got us going, why we wanted to look at this in the first place, is we really wanted to answer the question, is it possible to have privacy on mobile devices? Last year at the World Economic Forum, there's a ton of other quotes like this, but privacy, as we know, is no longer feasible. It's dead, right? Privacy is dead. And if you look at the recent news articles, it seems to be true, right? Facebook is listening to us every time we have our phone on. Pokemon Go has privacy concerns. They're using all of our accounts. And all of this stems from the fact that on these mobile devices, there's this constant play between feature versus privacy, right? We want to use our GPS system to get around Germany after we land at the airport, but we don't want random people following us around, as we're exploring the country. We want our microphones to wake up when we say, okay Google or hey Siri, but we don't want it to be listening when we're talking about private conversations. Environmental sensors should be able to figure out when we're exercising, but they shouldn't be able to tell our employers that we're doing something inappropriate or that we have some medical condition. And then we store our personal financial data, and then cameras, right, with all the obviously privacy implications. You could turn the camera on when people aren't aware of it. However, it seems like the users of these devices really want privacy, right? 57% in 2012 when they were surveyed said that they avoided applications due to privacy concerns. 87% of users last year said that they wanted to be in control of their data. And unsurprisingly, most cell phone users don't want people watching them when they're not allowed. I'm not sure what the other 7% were thinking, but apparently they're a little more voyeuristic. And in fact, a lot of top companies are actually even promoting their privacy-enhancing technologies now. You'll see Google and Apple actually tote these things, right? Especially in the FBI case that was just there. Apple really used this as a marketing tactic. So what we wanted to do in our SoK is we wanted to take a step back and look at the entire stack on these devices, right? It's not just software, it's not just hardware, it's not just user interaction. A lot of times at the conferences, we'll see specific papers that have specific technologies, but we're going to try and put that all together and see, why fundamentally is or is this not working. And an interesting observation, sort of when you look at the privacy stack, is that the more visible it is to the user, the less data it actually has access to. So it's sort of inversely proportional. Once you get down to the hardware level and these firmwares, they actually can access everything on your phone. But as an end user, you have very low visibility into that. So our hypothesis was that a lot of the privacy leaks are coming sort of from this weird interactions at different layers of the stack. So to go through that, our methodology, we first want to just look, what are the technologies that are actually out there on real phones today, right? What is Apple and Google and Microsoft and these type of companies actually pushing out to users, and evaluate them, right? Are they working? Do they have pros and cons? After that, we wanted to look, this is the stack portion, we wanted to look at the interactions between all of these things, all the technologies that are deployed, how do they actually interact? Can one undermine another? Where's the power lay? And then finally, we're going to look at the parties that are involved in and own these components, all the chips that you put in your phone, and what are their potential motives, right? Do they actually care about user privacy, or are they going to willingly share your data after you give it to them? And hopefully, at the end of this, we wanted to come up with a privacy worldview so that as a community, we can sort of agree on, here's the state where we are, and try to find some nice directions on where we think we should go in the future to really, hopefully revive privacy from the dead. So we'll go through the stack sort of one at a time. We picked a couple interesting things from the paper. There's obviously a lot more breadth in the SoK. We ended up with something like 184 references. So a lot of good stuff there to read. So we'll start at the user level. There's really two main things that we saw that the user is presented with. There's the privacy policies that every app or every website presents, how they're going to use your data, and then the user prompts. The privacy policies, we didn't see much previous work in there, but we were just curious, how readable are these? Did people have a clue what's going on? Our hypothesis was that they don't. So we actually downloaded the top 50 free and paid apps from Android, the top 100 free and paid apps from iOS, and ran them through, it's the Flesch-Kincaid algorithm, but it essentially tells you what level education you would need to understand the words written. And it turns out that only 32 32% are accessible to people with less than a college education. So while these companies are pushing privacy policies out, they're almost intentionally encoded in a way that you don't really know where your data is being used. The user prompts that are presented to users, I think this is no surprise to anybody at this conference. Most of the previous work shows that users either don't pay attention, just click yes to everything, and as a result, most of the apps are very over-provisioned. You can just request access to location, contacts, Pokemon Go, for example, your entire Google account, and people just say, yes, I need to catch Pikachu. And then finally, a lot of users don't even understand what's happening on these apps. Like when I give my location, what does that even mean? Right? The message really is not getting across very well. Moving down to the app layer, these are where things like encryption and permissions models come in. So ways that the apps are actually trying to handle your data responsibly. To look at the encryption problem, we took a look at the top 50 banking apps on both iOS and Android. Our reason for picking banking apps is we thought that they had the biggest motivation to do this correctly, since there's literally money on the line. So we just wanted to see if they did basic things like SSL certificate pinning, right? There's been a bunch of studies in the past that looked at this, and everyone always points and says, wow, no one even knows how to do the most simplest thing in pin certs. And we were hoping that when we look at this, after all the previous publications, they would have fixed it. Most of them did, some of them still didn't. So out of the top 50, there were 4 on iOS that we could still man in the middle, and 2 on Android that still weren't getting sort of the most easy to use parts of cryptography correctly. And for the permissions models, what we did in this one is we actually create an application both for iOS and Android that we use reflection and go and try to call all of the APIs just to see what kind of data we can access. We also did document scraping for all of the documented APIs. And what we found on Android's case is that with an app that had absolutely no permissions, we could actually read the wallpaper. We could, the picture that is your wallpaper. We could get fine-grained network activity, and they've shown in the past that this can be used. Even encrypted VoIP conversations can be decoded if you have fine enough grained network traffic. You could see your directory structure, and on both of them, we were getting low-level kernel crashes with absolutely no permissions given to this app. So it's kind of interesting how the permission system is working. The reflection did not work as well on iOS because it's Objective-C versus Java, so we just got a lot of crashes and it was really hard to get through, but there's more details on that in the paper. On the OS level, the two sort of highlighted things are the application sandboxing and application vetting. So in the sandboxing, what you really want to do is break out of it. And there's been a few documented cases where malware in the wild has actually done this, and it's been able to break out of the sandbox and fully compromise the mobile device. In some cases, they've even affected the developer tools. So sandbox aside, when the app is deployed to the App Store, it's already infected and is going to leak your data. And then there's a lot of interesting side channels. I noticed a couple of the titles in this section are also talking about these, where even perfect sandboxing, where one app can't access another, if you have access to the accelerometer, for example, you can see the taps and the passwords they're typing into other apps. And there was also a publication recently that showed by just looking at the aggregate power consumption, you could even see what the GPS radio was doing and Wi-Fi radios. And by some amazing statistics, they were able to geolocate themselves based on power consumption. And the application vetting process, again, this has been a very big cat and mouse game between malicious people and the vendors. And there's been ways to evade them in both. So in Android, there's been dynamic code loading where you would release the app and then later send a payload that it would load and do whatever privacy invasive thing you wanted to do. Loading from unknown sources is always dangerous, but people do it, and you have no guarantees, right? You're able to subvert the vetting process there. Again, Pokemon Go, people have been sideloading it like crazy. And then for evasion on iOS, there's the private APIs. So these are how we're getting the low-level kernel crashes, things that the APIs have to exist fundamentally, and they just tell you, please don't use them, right? But if there's a way that you can get through their vetting process and then use them, you can do all sorts of interesting things on the phones. And then finally, enterprise applications. So if you're a big enterprise, you want to deploy applications to your employees, for example, you don't go through Apple's process. But you can also give these to non-employees, and people have been doing that in the past. Some malware authors have used some enterprise certs to load phones legitimately with their application. Now at the firmware level, this is a place where there isn't really privacy-enhancing technologies. It's just sort of Most software people see it as hardware. Most hardware people see it as not really their problem either. So just sort of middle ground. But there's two technologies or two things that we thought were interesting about the firmware. One is they're pushing out a lot of these specialized coprocessors onto mobile devices. And what these do, the main purpose, is that they'll do things like record audio and talk to your accelerometer and ambient light sensor. And this is how, when you are running around and then you look at your iPhone later, it says, oh, you took 15 steps or 15,000 steps, and gives you all your workout statistics. And the reason that they're able to do that is they're very low power coprocessors, and they're on even when your phone seems like it's off. So our concern here is that malware or whomever could actually leverage these, and things like OK Google could start listening for words like bomb or whatever you're talking about and do covert things. The other one we thought was interesting is that when you want to interact, when they're building these phones, right? Say I have an Android phone and I want to include a specific chipset. I'm now required to include their drivers so that I can interact with that chipset, where I didn't explicitly give them access to anything, but just by loading their driver at a very privileged level, you're giving them access to, you're giving them the keys to the kingdom, right? They're running at system level, they're running at root privileges. So we wanted to look, specifically in this case, we looked at the NFC chipset. We just fuzzed the NFC drivers to see, is that opening vulnerabilities in the OS? And you can see there's a vast difference. We looked at the Nexus S, the Nexus 4. At the time, these were newish. We looked at the 5, there were 0 crashes, uninteresting to put on the slide. Galaxy S7, 0 crashes, uninteresting. But the takeaway is that the chipset you use and the drivers you include are actually, again, adding to this complexity and possibly opening you up to vulnerabilities. Finally, at the mobile privacy, at the hardware level, there are two very interesting technologies. One are trusted execution environments. These are hardware-isolated regions that you can do sensitive acts. You can store crypto keys, for example. The concern we see here is that they have unlimited access to the entire system. And there's an entirely separate OS running in the trusted OS that in most cases can get over-the-air updates as well. And finally, the dedicated cryptographic units. These are used to protect your data at rest. The concern here is that we see is that there's low visibility currently, and there's not much regulation on this. So in the FBI Apple case, can Apple break their own encryption? Nobody really knows. So to wrap it up, I'd just like to walk through an example of what we consider our privacy worldview with a location-based application. So say we have an app like Tinder, Pokemon Go, Waze that we're using, and it wants to acquire the location of your device. It has various ways to do this. It can look at your Wi-Fi SSID, it can use GPS directly, tons of different side channels, and all these firmware is written by different companies. Again, once it has access to your data, so do all of the third-party libraries that app included. Things like AdMob, Chartbooster, companies that we're not really aware of. Again, the OS inherently has access to all of this data, right? It's the main OS running on the phone. More interestingly, the trusted OS that runs under all of this can subvert any privacy protection that's put in place at any of those layers above it. So that's another concern that I think I was mostly unaware of when we started doing this research, and is kind of interesting, right? And companies like Trustonic, Qualcomm, Huawei, that maybe you didn't realize had full control over your device. Then again, there's the baseband processor. In many cases, this shares memory, so the baseband can access any memory directly, and in the same way the trusted OS can, it can subvert any technologies we're deploying on these devices. Once it goes out over the network, anybody in your cellular network, if it's not encrypted properly, has access. Again, over Wi-Fi, if you're on an unprotected hotspot, you're potentially revealing your data. And once it gets to the cloud, who knows? Final interesting tidbit, looking at the architecture of the devices, it's actually in the specification that SIM cards are allowed to query the GPS receiver on their own. They actually, again, run a separate operating system. It can then get your GPS. The SIM card can talk directly to your baseband, send AT commands, and send SMS messages without ever interacting with the application processor. Weird, complicated hardware architecture. And finally, once it's in the cloud, a lot of these will actually open up public APIs. So things like Tinder has been shown that you can just go and query Tinder and find location of any of their users on Earth. And we verified that, and it's slightly creepy. So in summary, we think that modern devices are extremely complex across all layers. And we think that these ill-defined trust relationships are really what's leading to a lot of these privacy leakages. Android might not explicitly trust this trusted OS, but the fact that it's there, they're not necessarily protecting against it, right? That it can subvert any of their software-based mechanisms. We think that any effective privacy-enhancing technologies that are really going to be hardened have to take into consideration the hardware and the software and these bizarre interactions. And we think that we're going to ultimately see more and more data leaks if we don't do fundamentally new approaches. So we think complexity is the enemy of both security and privacy. And I will leave a couple suggestions up here during the Q&A.